I was looking at something, of course, on Twitter where I see most of my perception of reality. And there's something going around, which I think is very, very smart. And people are comparing the Big Short, which was that huge bet in 2008 against the subprime market, and they made a movie about it, to Michael Saylor borrowing money at 0.75% and going long Bitcoin and calling this the big long. I mean, there is some symmetry there. It's another kind of a Wall Street reference. Tina, your thoughts?
Well, I spent a lot of time short selling, and I used to go to things like grants conferences, and I was very much of a grants follower. I knew a lot of these guys. I followed a lot of them, guys like Bill Fleckenstein and Fred Hickey and others. And I did short a lot of stocks. I think what these guys don't understand is that Bitcoin is it's a short on the entire legacy system. And it's a brand new technology that's going to completely remake the economic paradigm. And I think people are missing this. I think they miss how big this is. It's a much better paradigm than the existing economic paradigm, which is very unfair in many ways. And I think that this is huge. I think that it is beyond huge. It's not just about making money. And I think people have the wrong take on a lot of this. They want to overlay the way they see the world with the way Bitcoin has to be. And I think that's completely wrong. Technology changes the way the world works. People have a hard time imagining a world that's different from the world that they know. And technology is constantly changing how things work, and you wind up with new institutions and new ways of doing things, which completely replace and displace things. Henry Ford said, if people had asked me, they would have asked for faster horses. And I think that this is constantly a human foible to assume that you're going to take new technologies and new ways of doing things. I argue that banking was a technological solution. We're still working with a technological solution which was invented in like the 13 or the 1400s. Banking is going to completely be revamped and completely changed and maybe completely eliminated. People think fractional reserve banking has to exist, and I disagree with that entirely. Fractional reserve banking existed for a particular reason, because the money was such that you had to have fractional reserve banking. With money which is divisible the way Bitcoin is, which is essentially infinitely divisible, where payments can be made virtually instantly, the entire way that the legacy system evolves is going to become an entirely different system. It's not going to be an overlay. And there's this very strong risk, and I think a risk that a lot of people who are coming to, quote unquote, the crypto space, who don't really get this, is that Bitcoin is going to displace all of those things that exist in the system that we have today. It's going to completely remake it. And if you try to build a model of a business based on legacy, guess what? You're going to be blown out of the water in the next decade, and your business won't exist. If you're building for yesteryear, you're not going to exist in that business by the end of the decade. You have to skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck is, and certainly not to where the puck was. And so I think you have a lot of people who think they're smart, who think they understand things, and they're getting it all wrong.
Yeah. Is there, like there was with the Big Short, which was the taking down of the subprime market by some Wall Street sharpies who made billions doing so. Michael Saylor is engaging in the big long. He's engaging in a speculative attack where he can borrow at 0.75%, which is extraordinarily cheap historically. And he's buying Bitcoin effectively to attack the Fed and attack the US dollar in the same way that George Soros did in 1992. They attacked the British pound and they broke the Bank of England. They forced Britain out of the exchange rate mechanism, and Soros made $1 billion in a week. It seems to me that Michael Saylor is launching this speculative attack against the US dollar by borrowing at these artificially low rates and loading up on Bitcoin. And and the dollar is getting weak. I saw it's weak again today. It's looking terrible. If the dollar keeps getting weaker, that means we got a real problem on our hands in America, because inflation is going to start really printing at numbers that nobody's seen in 20, 30 years. And the people making money on Bitcoin as it gallops through 100,000 and beyond are going to be like, well, we told you so. But guess what? The keys are unconfiscatable, so go fuck yourself, right? And
Right.
right? Is that what we're, we're Wall Street veterans. I mean, when Paul Tudor Jones said it's the fastest horse in the race and it's good for humanity, that's like throwing red meat to a cage full of lions.
I have to say, I see it differently, Max. And number one, I think that people conflate a weaker dollar in currency terms as opposed to a weaker dollar in buying power terms. And I think this happens all the time. And I think a lot of people do it. And I think it's a mistake to do that. The weakness in the dollar is reflected in both inflation as well as in currency terms. And it's not only the currency terms that matter. In fact, I would argue that the weakness in the dollar is more in inflation terms. And what we've seen in the last 40 years has been asset inflation. So what happens is the dollar weakness is reflected in an S&P that goes up compounded annually at some very high rate, and NASDAQ, which does similarly. That's the real weakness in the dollar. That's the big, broader weakness in the dollar and fiat currencies generally. So I don't quite agree with the speculative attack argument.
Right. No, I get it. We got asset inflation, and the Fed's claiming they're fighting deflation, even though if you included something that Michael Saylor points out, he said that 20 years ago, you could buy $1 million in bonds and get a 5% coupon and have $50,000 a year in income. And now you need 10 to 20 times that purchase in bonds. And that's genuine inflation in his terms, right? But we have asset price inflation for sure. But the average person in America, because everything's been outsourced to China and because our energy is basically coming in from countries that we have colonized in the Middle East, the average American doesn't really have a price to sticker shock when they go shop for food or they buy their gasoline. So now with the weakness in the dollar that we're seeing and the inability to control that weakness in the dollar because the Fed is completely tapped out, and Michael Saylor has provided a vector out of this mess, unlike gold. Gold is not the vector out because it's totally controlled. And people start saying, wait a minute, my CPI just doubled in the last 6 months. And, my dollar can't buy 25 cents worth of groceries that I got in 2018, right? I mean, that's real CPI inflation. Can't be, it's the genie's out of the bottle and there's no way to bring it back in. I mean, that's what I think is going to catch people's attention. And that's also going to start some panic buying into Bitcoin. It's the fastest horse in the race, gold, and, we'll get some of the ancillary benefit of that, but it won't be like Bitcoin, which is set to, print many multiples of the current price.
When it comes to currency collapses, from what I know of it, and I'm no expert in it, although I do remember, I forget where I was. I was traveling somewhere when that happened. Can't remember where it was. It was, I think, in 1992. Usually it's because locals are fleeing their currency. But I don't think this is just about a currency collapse. I think that's really wrong. I think that you're actually going to watch Bitcoin go up a lot in value and people will simply adopt the new system. I think that people have buying urgency because the price goes up. And I don't
but it goes up against what?
It goes up against the dollar.
The dollar is already in a hyperinflationary collapse against Bitcoin right now. Absolutely. It's just not hit the mainstream media yet.
Absolutely.
Once you've got $100,000 Bitcoin and people also are losing, they can't afford food anymore, that's going to be highly problematic as the politics of that in America in 2021.
But I don't think you're going to have a situation where people can't afford food. I think what you're going to see is you're going to see Bitcoin going up in value. Yeah, I like to ask this question because, see, I actually don't like this take. I don't like this framing because I don't really agree with it. And I think it brings about more fear than it brings about a positive nature and discussion of Bitcoin. So I'm not a fan of this. I'm not a fan of the speculative attack argument.
Just a quick side note, people already can't afford food. You got 150 million people in America out below the poverty line, and the food stamp programs and the other programs, if you pull the plug on those, you'd have that homeless crisis go up by dramatically anyway. as it is. People living in their cars to work at Walmart for the wages that don't support a lifestyle. So the poverty is an incredible problem in America.
I agree.
Right now, and any kind of dynamic change to the purchasing power of the dollar will exacerbate that to extraordinary levels.
Yep.
I don't think
I'm seeing it that way too. Go ahead.
I don't think that's what we're going to see, though. I don't think it plays out quite like that.
Well, the only way to not play it out like that is to print more money, right? We know that 30% of all the money ever been printed in America has been done so in the last two years or 3 years. Don't quote me on the exact numbers there, but it's an extraordinary up ramp. You see the M1 money supply in the last 6 months, like that hockey stick, just skyrocketing to the moon. Who's the biggest buyer of all this debt? It's America itself. It's the Federal Reserve Bank. So you've got this fiat currency crisis heading all over the world. The dollar is backed, according to Paul Krugman at the New York Times, by men with guns, right? So, and of course, if that's backing the dollar, the military industrial complex, which spends $250 million a day on gas alone, just to keep the tanks fueled up. That's what America pays on their daily gas bill, right? So now gas is, just goes up 3 or 4x. Right. And now the military, like every empire, they're like, we can't afford the freaking gas, man. The military's toast. And America can't support the dollar anymore. China, Russia, Iran, all these countries are already doing side deals and bilateral deals and getting out of the dollar as fast as they can and buying Bitcoin. The dollar collapses. There's no way you can sugarcoat a dollar collapse. There's no rosy ending to that story. Its loss of purchasing power is profound. And the poverty that's already extremely pervasive in America, it goes through the roof, and you already have social unrest. So why not pour some gasoline on all those street protests? Why don't we get 1 million people on the street, torching cars? Like this is 2021, coming soon not to a theater near you.
I think you're right. Ultimately, I'm not sure if it's a 2021 event. I do think that they probably continue to play the same games with spending and controlling the yield curve, which is effectively money printing. So I do agree with that. I don't like the framing of it, and I don't know exactly. I think you watch a Bitcoin system grow dramatically, and it becomes like a giant craft which enables people to enter a new system. It doesn't have to be a meltdown quite described like that. If people,
right, look, I'm presenting a Van Gogh. You can put it in any frame you want. It doesn't change the quality of the painting. Right. All the essences, all the colors, all the composition, all the brush strokes I've been building now since Reagan, and then Clinton, who got rid of Glass-Steagall, who they brought in the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which totally undermined the U.S. economy and gave Wall Street the keys to the castle. They printed trillions of dollars. They bailed out all the banks. They bailed out long-term capital management. They engaged in moral hazard to the point where moral hazard became the de facto business model of America. Jamie Dimon keeps 90 cents of every dollar he steals. And that's the business model, fraud. Now that's unsustainable. And the only way we got a good scenario on the other end of this is that you got to let the system collapse. That's unfortunately what's got to happen sometimes. You got to let the system collapse. The sooner America utterly collapses and GDP collapses by 80%, the sooner we can rebuild this shit and have a country worth living in. Right now, it's not worth living in this country. It's complete disaster area. We need the whole thing to completely collapse. And then the Constitution as an idea, the Bill of Rights as an idea, that will survive because you can't kill an idea. We build from scratch and Bitcoin becomes the reserve currency. That's definitely going to happen, but it's going to be a hell of a lot higher than it is here. If you want to be one of the architects of new America, buy Bitcoin now, become individually sovereign, and be the Ben Franklin of the 21st century. Or you can sit around with your dick in your hands and be fucking poor and eating dirt. Those are the two alternatives in 2021.
Max.
Well, then
look, hold on one second, Tina. Hold on one second, Tina. So this is I'm leaning on toward the max side of the equation on this one. Now, I don't know like about the riots in the streets and the politics of fear, but we also have to be real at the same time, because I don't think that we can necessarily put this thing back in the bottle at this point, right? So, like Max was saying on the Swan Land that you guys were at like a couple weeks ago, Michael Saylor's pulled the pin out at this point and just like thrown the grenade into the boardroom of the the Federal Reserve Bank, right? So, how do you stop it at this point? Once the play shows that it's going well, I mean, we had PTJ was on May, it was in May of this year. MicroStrategy first announced this thing in August of this year. Since then, we're just seeing cascade, and all of this stuff happening behind the scenes. We're just going to see over the weeks and months of the coming year. And then it's not just equity and cash that they're putting into Bitcoin. It's now, low interest debt that the other side apparently just doesn't get yet. So everyone who understands what's happening gets to leverage up on everyone who doesn't understand what's happening. That's just like this massive cascade, and that's why we call it hyper Bitcoinization. It's like goes gradually, then absolute suddenly.
Well,
right?
okay.
So how does that not happen? How do we go? How do we go to 2020?
Pro Bitcoin bet using interest rates that are artificially low because they've been bailing out the banks for 20 years and destroying the economy as a result. Michael Saylor stood up and said, "I could have bought back my own stock with these cheap rates, and I could have had stock options, and I could have made billions of dollars that way. But I think actually inflation's a real problem. So instead, I'm going to attack the Fed by doing a speculative attack by borrowing at these incredibly cheap rates and going long Bitcoin." And I think that is the pin being pulled on the grenade. And I think a lot of very wealthy people are going to do the exact same thing and follow in Michael Saylor's footsteps. And that means there's $100 trillion sitting in investable accounts around the world. Bitcoin market cap is under 300 billion. If only 5% of that money goes into Bitcoin, do the math. It goes a lot higher from here, and it takes a whole new generation with it, because the millennials and the Gen Z are into Bitcoin. The baby boomers, they're going to get completely rolled over, and they should rightfully get rolled over, because they're the ones who gave the millennials all the student debt. They made housing unaffordable, and they totally stole everything from the economy. And now they're going to get their comeuppance, and they deserve it.
So if you're right, and it plays out like that in 2021, as you say, your numbers are actually way off, because the numbers for 2021 start to look like north of 500,000 to 1 million, and the numbers for 2022 start to look like 10 million, and the numbers for 2023 start to look like 20 to 50 million. You don't have $100,000 Bitcoin next year. You have somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million Bitcoin next year, and $10 million Bitcoin the year after, and $20 to $50 million Bitcoin the year after.
Hold on, I got to smash buy some more Bitcoin on Swan right now. It's got me totaled up. I'm pumped up. Here I am on my limit. Raise my limit, Corey. I hit my limit again. Raise my limit, damn it. I feel a need for the corn.
Because the scenario of Michael Saylor types leveraging their balance sheet with debt to buy Bitcoin, you start to wildly reprice this thing in ways that is not accounted for in Plan B's stock to flow. It's wildly underaccounted for. So no, but if that starts to become something, just moving people's assets as they are now into Bitcoin gives you somewhere between few $100,000 in the next 1 to 3 years. I think $200,000 to $400,000. But if you're going to get people who start to engage in that type of activity, borrowing to buy Bitcoin on that kind of size, then the numbers shoot up exponentially. Those numbers are way too low, because Plan B's numbers are based on comparisons of a world where that's not taking place. You don't have people borrowing to that extent to go buy assets which are fixed in supply with a known supply. So it's going to be like, bigger than an elephant stepping on a tube of toothpaste with a pinhole in it. It's going to be numbers that are much, much bigger than numbers that we expect if that kind of buying takes place. I don't know that.
Well, look, I mean, the Tinder is dry.
I agree.
Michael Saylor has thrown, started the fire, and it's a very dry fire, because the world in America, for example, just look at this whole stock buyback farce. Apple Computer earnings have been going down for 10 years, and yet the stock's worth over like it's close to $2 trillion. Why is that? Because of fraud, accounting fraud. They buy back their own stock with this cheap money, and they report earnings that are not going down, but they supposedly are going up, which is a complete. It used to be illegal to buy back your own stock until Reagan changed the law, and for obvious reasons, it's outright fraud. And all these companies in the S&P 500 engage in this massive accounting fraud. When people realize, the emperor has no clothes, there's no earnings. Tesla at 1,000 times earnings. Give me a break there. But if you adjusted for the buybacks, the S&P right now would be down 50% from where it is today. 50%. So imagine that. So the S&P collapses by 50% in a week, like Enron disappeared in a day because everyone realized it's all accounting fraud. And so now you got the contraction of that multi-trillion-dollar asset. If part of that money is going to jump into Bitcoin, and I agree with you, 100,000 is too low of a bar, because when the cascade effect kicks in, you're going to see $100,000 snap like Bolsa would, and just like go from there. There's no top. There's no top because with this fraudulent paper money system, there's no bottom.
Well, I don't disagree with anything you say. I don't think things work that fast, but they could. They could absolutely work that fast, because I've been looking at this since the early 90s. I think the Fed has been fucking up since the early 90s. I don't think people realize how much the Fed has been fucking up since the early 90s. I don't think people understand how bad policy is. And I do think that that money has been fleeing. Right now, we have had a wicked inflation for a few decades already. We don't see it as that because it feels good. It's a feel-good inflation because it's an asset inflation. But if things start to accelerate like that, then the price of Bitcoin will really start to grow beyond numbers that I'm previously talking about. And we'll see a massive escalation, and the whole thing will be completely different. It will
completely devastated. All the models will be completely destroyed, like Saylor
models
said. Break them to the upside, just breaking them all to the upside. But the thing is, I think that we've all been thinking that was going to happen in 6 to 8 years. Well, but we've had a black swan this year, and it's pulling everything forward. And now Michael Saylor's pulled the pin, and speculative attack is on the table, and like all bets are off.